They said she was digging her own grave. That was the story Harlan Beckett told at the mill one gray November morning, leaning against the doorframe with his coffee going cold in his hand, his voice carrying the particular ease of a man who has already decided how a story ends. The other men laughed, not cruelly, just the tired, knowing laugh of people who have seen enough of the world to recognize a lost cause when it comes crawling out of the hillside covered in mud. A girl, Harlan said, 15 years old, digging a hole in the North Ridge like a badger gone mad. The Voss girl. You remember Callum Voss, the rock man from Philadelphia, the one who spent 10 years tapping on boulders with a little hammer while his neighbors were clearing fields and putting up fences. That girl, digging her own grave up on the ridge while a hard winter rolls in like a freight train. The men shook their heads. Someone said it was a shame. Someone else said her father had always been peculiar. The conversation moved on the way conversations do when the subject is someone else's misfortune. Harlan finished his coffee. He did not think about the girl again. Not that morning. But the story does not begin at the mill. It begins 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday in October when the last warmth drained out of the Virginia sky like water from a cracked basin, and Wren Voss walked out of her aunt's house with a burlap sack over one shoulder and nowhere on earth to go. She was 15 years old and she had been an orphan for exactly 23 days. Her father, Dr. Callum Voss, had died on the 3rd of October, 1918. The influenza took him the way it was taking men and women across the entire country that year, quickly, brutally, without negotiation. He had been a thin man to begin with, scholarly and distracted, more comfortable with rock formations than with people, and when the fever came for him, it found very little resistance. 4 days after he took to bed, he was gone. Her mother, Lucia, had gone 4 days before him. Wren had sat with both of them at the end. She had held her mother's hand and listened to the shallow, labored breathing slow and then stop. She had done the same for her father, though he was unconscious for most of it and would not have known she was there. She told herself he knew. Children tell themselves many things. She was the last Voss in Blue Ridge County, Virginia. The community of Ridgewood Hollow was the kind of place that had strong opinions about belonging. It was a small settlement pressed into a fold of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a mill, a general store, a church, 40-odd families scratching a living from rocky soil and pine forest. The people were not unkind by nature. They were simply people who had learned that survival was a mathematics problem and every winter recalculated the sum. Callum Voss had never quite added up. He had come from Philadelphia 12 years ago, with his young wife, his boxes of geological survey equipment, and his peculiar conviction that the mountains of Virginia contained formations of extraordinary scientific interest. He had bought a small piece of land, built a modest cabin, and proceeded to spend the better part of a decade walking the ridges with his rock hammer, filling notebook after notebook with drawings and measurements and observations that no one in Ridgewood Hollow could read or cared to understand. He was not disliked. He was something stranger than disliked. He was irrelevant. In a community where a man's worth was measured in cords of wood split and fields cleared and fences mended, Callum Voss produced nothing visible. He could not discuss the merits of one plow horse over another. He had no opinion on the best way to chink a log wall against the winter draft. When other men gathered on the porch of the general store to talk about weather and prices in the war, Callum would listen politely for a while and then find some reason to excuse himself, because somewhere on the North Ridge there was an outcropping of metamorphic schist that was not behaving the way his theory predicted, and that was where his mind really was. His wife Lucia had been the bridge. She was warm and practical and funny in the dry way of women who have chosen to love difficult men, and the community had accepted her the way you accept a pleasant surprise. When she died, that bridge went with her. Wren had inherited her father's eyes, dark-focused, always looking slightly past the surface of things, and her mother's silence, the kind that was not emptiness but depth. She had grown up half in one world and half in another, helping with the garden and the chickens and the ordinary business of survival, but also sitting beside her father at the kitchen table on winter evenings while he explained rock strata to her with the same gravity and patience he might have used with a graduate student at a university. She understood things about mountains that none of the other children in Ridgewood Hollow would ever be taught. None of that mattered now. She moved to her Aunt Dorothea's house the week after her parents died because there was nowhere else to move. Dorothea Pruitt was her mother's older sister, a widow with 4 children of her own, a farm that barely produced enough, and a face that had been weathered by loss until all the softness had been pressed out of it like moisture from old wood. She was not a cruel woman. Cruelty requires a certain expenditure of feeling that Dorothea could not afford. She was simply a woman running a set of numbers, and Wren was a number that did not work. The conversation when it came was not a confrontation. Wren almost wished it had been a confrontation, would have been something to push against. Instead, it was a Tuesday evening in mid-October, 3 weeks after her parents died, and she and Dorothea were sitting at the dinner table with the 4 Pruitt children eating in silence. And Dorothea looked at Wren's plate, and then at Wren's face, and then back at the plate, with the expression of a woman reviewing accounts she already knows are short. "There's another winter coming," Dorothea said. Her voice was flat, not angry, not apologetic. Flat as a ruled line on a ledger page. "A hard one, they're saying." Wren looked at her aunt across the table. "We have mouths enough to feed," Dorothea said. "You understand." Wren understood. "You mean?" She did not argue. She had no argument that would change the arithmetic. She was not kin enough to outweigh the cost of her keep, and she had no labor to offer that one of the 4 Pruitt children could not provide. She was a deficit, a line item in red ink. She had seen her father balance enough ledgers to know what that meant. She nodded once, and Dorothea nodded back, and that was the end of it. The next morning, Wren packed her burlap sack. She moved through the small bedroom she had been sleeping in. It had been the eldest Pruitt girl's room, and the girl had been sleeping in the kitchen since Wren arrived, which Wren had known and carried like a weight in her chest, and she took only what was hers. A flint and steel, a small folding knife with a worn bone handle that had been her father's. Half a loaf of bread that Dorothea had left on the table without comment, which was as much kindness as the woman had to give. And the journal. She almost left it. It was the last thing she packed, standing at the door with her sack over her shoulder, and she looked at it sitting on the small table by the window, where she had placed it when she arrived and had not touched it since. A leather-bound notebook, the cover cracked and dark with years of handling, smelling of pipe smoke, and the particular dry mineral smell that had always clung to her father's clothes. Her name was written on the inside cover in his neat, careful script. Not to Wren or for Wren, just Wren, the way you label something that belongs to someone completely. She had not opened it since he died. Every time she reached for it, the grief came up in her throat like floodwater, and she pulled her hand away. She picked it up now, put it in the sack, walked out the door. She did not look back. Looking back was an invitation to the particular kind of pity she could not afford, the pity she could see in the faces of the other families in Ridgewood Hollow as she walked through the settlement that morning, the curtains shifting in windows, the carefully averted eyes of women hanging washing in yards that were already cold. They saw a tragedy in motion, a child walking into the teeth of an Appalachian winter with a burlap sack and nowhere to go. Wren walked faster. For 2 days, she moved through the hills without direction, following deer trails, staying in the tree line, eating the bread in careful portions. She knew these mountains the way any child knows the landscape of their childhood, by feel and instinct, by the angle of morning light through a particular gap in the ridges, by the sound of a specific creek. Her father had brought her up here 100 times. She knew which outcroppings yielded flat stones for fire-making, which hollows held standing water, which slopes collected deadfall for shelter. Knowing things and surviving on them are not the same knowledge. The first night she built a fire in a shallow ravine and huddled over it until it died, then burrowed into a pile of leaves like a small animal. The cold woke her twice. She had not understood before that night how intelligent cold was, how it found every gap in her clothing, every unprotected inch of skin, and inserted itself with precise methodical patience, not attacking but occupying the way water occupies a cracked stone before winter does the rest. The second day was harder. The bread was gone. She found some late-season berries dried and meager and ate them without stopping. The sky had taken on that bruised, swollen look that old-timers called a snow sky. Not this week probably, but soon. The second night she lay in her leaf pile and looked up at a strip of cold stars between the branches and thought about her father. Not with the soft haziness of grief, but with the sharp, specific clarity of someone trying to solve a problem. Dr. Callum Voss had been many things that Ridgewood Hollow considered useless. He had also been a man who spent 10 years studying these exact mountains and who had written down everything he found. He had talked to Wren about his work the way other fathers talk to their children about fishing or farming as the natural inheritance of a practical education. She sat up in the leaves. She pulled the journal from her sack. The stars gave just enough light to read if she held the pages close to her face. She turned past the early pages, the careful geological diagrams, the cross-sections of hillsides rendered in her father's precise hand, the columns of measurements and mineral notations that she had sat beside him to learn, and looked for the map. She knew it was there. She had seen it 100 times when she was young, sitting on a stool beside his work table, while he explained the formations of the North Ridge. She found it near the middle of the journal, a hand-drawn map of the North Ridge sketched in faded pencil with ink notations added later. Most of the notations were geological strata labels, compass bearings, elevation marks. But near the top right of the map, her father had circled a single location in red ink. Beside the circle in handwriting, slightly less careful than his usual notes, the handwriting of a man excited writing. Quickly, he had written 2 words, Thermopylae Minor, and beneath that, a longer note. The mountain breathes here. Constant exhalation from depth. Warm air, mineral-laden, imperceptible in summer. A lifeline in winter. The earliest settlers knew these places. The land tells its secrets only to those who listen. Wren sat with the journal on her knees for a long time. Her father had been a man of genuine brilliance who had died in a cold boarding house room in Philadelphia while she sat at his side. His brilliance had not saved him. His theories had not kept him warm. The community of Ridgewood Hollow had judged him clearly and completely, a man of books and rocks in a world of axes and plows, a dreamer who produced nothing you could stack or sell or burn. She looked at the red circle on the map. She looked at the strip of cold stars above the bare branches. The cold in her feet had become the steady, deep ache that precedes numbness, which precedes something worse. She closed the journal. She looked at the map's orientation one more time, memorizing the landmarks. A boulder formation. Her father had sketched a cluster of birch trees marked with a small asterisk. She knew the North Ridge. She could find the location by morning. She did not decide to trust her father. Not exactly. She decided that she had no other move to make, and that if she was going to die in these mountains, she would rather die trying his idea than lying still in a pile of leaves. That is not the same thing as faith, but sometimes it is where faith begins. She found it in the early afternoon of the 3rd day. The landmarks on the map were subtle, the kind of details you only notice if someone has trained you to look. A granite boulder split cleanly down the middle, the two halves slightly separated, as if by a slow, deliberate hand, its fracture faces forming a shape that might generously be called a heart. 3 birch trees growing in an unnaturally tight cluster, their white trunks leaning slightly inward toward each other like figures in a whispered conversation. A sheer face of gray granite streaked with quartz veins running along the base of the ridge for perhaps 30 yards. At the far end of that granite face, hidden behind a curtain of withered rhododendron, there was a crack. It was not dramatic. She had expected something dramatic, a vent, a crevice, some visible evidence of the thing her father had written about with such intensity. Instead, it was a dark line no wider than her open hand running vertically through the rock from about knee height to above her head with packed earth and dead roots filling most of the gap. She knelt down her knees, protesting on the frozen ground. She held her palm a few inches from the opening. Nothing. The cold of the air around her swallowed whatever might have been there, or perhaps there was nothing to find. Perhaps her father's notes were the beautiful delusions of a brilliant mind, untethered from the practical world, and she was kneeling in the frost in front of a crack in a rocks, while a winter that intended to kill her was building itself up over the horizon. And then it was not a gust, not a current. It was a presence, a steady, patient, unwavering breath of air that was not cold, that was not even neutral. It was warm, faintly, certainly undeniably warm, carrying with it the scent of deep, wet stone and something older, cleaner, something that had no name she knew, except that it felt the opposite of the dead leaf smell of winter. She pressed her cheek against the opening. The air touched her skin like a hand. She closed her eyes. She was 15 years old, and she had not been warm in 3 days. And in that moment, with the warmth of the earth's deep interior breathing against her cold face, she understood what her father had spent 10 years trying to tell a people who would not listen. This was not a theory. This was not a geological curiosity. This was the difference between dying and not dying. She opened the journal again. The page after the map contained a drawing she had not looked at closely as a child. A cross-section diagram carefully rendered in her father's architectural hand labeled at the top, in his small, deliberate script, the earth hearth. A tunnel widening into a rounded chamber. The geothermal vent at the rear wall labeled constant heat source, geologically stable, requires no fuel. The walls labeled thermal mass absorbs and radiates, creates ambient warmth. An entry passage with a notation natural draft pulls smoke outward, small cooking fire, at entrance viable. Below the diagram, a single line: I believe a person could live here through any winter at minimal cost. The earth does not demand tribute. It only asks to be understood. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at the crack in the rock. She looked at her small folding knife, her hands, the pile of flat shale slabs lying in the rockfall 10 feet away. She was 15 years old, on a mountain with no shovel, no pickaxe, no tools designed for the work she was contemplating. She had a knife and a piece of flint and a drawing in a dead man's notebook. She thought about the second night in the leaves, the cold that had slid under her skin like a blade. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table on winter evenings, explaining the formations of the North Ridge with a patience that only made sense if he believed genuinely and completely that she would one day need to know. She picked up a flat shard of shale from the rockfall. She wedged it into the crack in pride. The rock gave a small, grudging sound, and a crumble of packed earth and grit fell to the ground. She pried again. This was how it began. She worked until the light died and then slept at the mouth of the crack, curled against the warmth that leaked from it, and woke to find the frost had not reached her. In the gray pre-dawn, she worked again. The shale blade broke on the third day, and she fashioned another from the rockfall. Her hands blistered, and the blisters broke, and the skin beneath grew harder and more useful than the original skin had been. Time became very simple. There was the work, and there was the rest. There was the foraging late-season nuts, frozen berries beaten from withered canes. One fortunate morning when she found a cache of dried mushrooms sheltered under a granite overhang, and there was the return to the work. The tunnel deepened by inches. The warm air grew stronger as the passage widened. It was not imagination. The deeper she cut into the hillside, the more clearly she could feel it, the mountain's breath, steady and ancient and entirely indifferent to the season. On the 9th day, she could crawl fully into the tunnel, and the temperature difference was unmistakable. Outside, November was tightening its grip on the ridge, the morning sharpening towards something harder. Inside the tunnel, even this shallow, there was warmth. Not fire warmth, not the aggressive, radiant heat of a cast iron stove. Something quieter, something that did not shout. It was on the 9th day that Harlan Beckett found her. He came over the ridge following a buck he had been tracking since morning, a large white-tailed deer he had seen twice before and not been able to get a clean shot at. He was a methodical hunter, as he was methodical in most things, and he had followed the tracks to the North Ridge without much thought for where they were leading, because he knew this terrain the way a man knows his own property after 30 years of walking it. He saw the pile of excavated earth first. It sat at the base of the granite face like a wound raw and dark against the pale frost. He stopped, looked at it, followed it with his eyes to the widened crack in the rock face now tall enough for a person to crouch through. Then Wren backed out of it. She emerged the way a fox leaves a burrow economically low to the ground, already in motion before she was fully out turning to add another armful of excavated debris to the pile. Her face and hands and the front of her dress were the color of the earth she was moving. She did not notice him until she turned around. Harlan Beckett was 58 years old. He had come to the Blue Ridge as a young man and built something, literally built it with his hands, board by board and nail by nail and beam by beam. He had built the mill that gave the hollow its livelihood. He had built the largest cabin in the settlement, solid and square and permanent, the kind of structure that said, "I intend to stay." He had built a reputation for judgment and practical sense that the community leaned on the way you lean on a fence post that has never moved. He was not a man given to disbelief. He had seen enough strange things in his years to know the world was wider than any one man's certainty. But what he was looking at, this slight, filthy, calm-eyed girl standing in front of a hole she had dug with a piece of broken shale, produced in him a sensation he rarely experienced, which was the sensation of genuinely not understanding what he was seeing. "Wren Voss," he said. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that were so much like her father's. It was briefly unsettling. She did not seem surprised to see him. She did not seem embarrassed. She pushed the debris off her hands and waited. "Children," he said, "what in the name of God are you doing?" She looked at the tunnel opening. She looked back at him. "Digging," she said. It was not an answer designed to invite conversation, but he stepped closer anyway, drawn by the inexplicable wrongness of the situation, and as he approached the crack in the granite face, he noticed something that stopped him more effectively than the girl's answer had. The air near the opening was not cold. He frowned, held his bare hand toward the gap, felt a faint but unmistakable flow of warmth. He pulled his hand back with the instinctive recoil of a man who has just encountered something unexpected in a place he thought he knew completely. "That's cave damp," he said. His voice had the firm, brisk quality of a man returning quickly to solid ground. "That's what comes out of a bad cave, rotten air lung, fever air. You breathe enough of that, and you'll be in the ground for real." Wren shook her head once without heat. "It's not cave damp, it's geothermal. It comes from deep in the rock. My father mapped it." "Your father," Harlan said and stopped himself. He had been about to say something he did not quite have the cruelty to say, which was that her father's opinions about what came out of the ground carried a certain amount less weight now that the ground had him. He rearranged himself. "Your father was a good man," he said carefully, "but this kind of thing, digging into a hillside in November alone with—" He looked at the improvised shale tool on the debris pile. "With a piece of rock, this isn't shelter, Wren. This is a grave you're digging yourself." She said nothing for a moment. She looked at his hands. He had large hands, calloused and strong, the hands of a man who had built things for 30 years. Then she looked at her own hands, and he noticed with a strange, discomforting sensation that they were not a child's hands anymore. The palms were raw and newly calloused. The knuckles scraped the fingernails, broken, short, and dark with ground-in earth. "Everything you built, Mr. Beckett," she said, "is made of wood." He waited. "Wood burns out," she said. "I'm building with something older than fire." The words were not quite what he had expected. There was no defiance in them, no teenage bravado, no reckless emotion. They had the quality of a statement of fact delivered by someone who had been living alone on a mountain for 9 days and had thought the matter through. He offered her work. He was a fair man, and this was a fair offer, a place in the Beckett household tasks. She could manage a warm corner by the stove through the winter in exchange for her labor. It was the rational offer, the kind offer a reasonable person would take. She looked at him with her father's eyes, those eyes that always seemed to be looking slightly past the surface of things, and she said quietly and without apology, "No, but thank you, Mr. Beckett." He stood there for a moment longer. He could have pushed further. He could have made the argument more forceful, reminded her of the coming cold, the isolation, the 100 practical ways this scheme would kill her. He had all the arguments ready. They were good arguments. They were correct. But there was something in her stillness that made the arguments feel not wrong exactly, but somehow beside the point, as if she had already heard them, already weighed them against something he could not see and found them insufficient. He turned and walked back over the ridge toward home. The story of the Voss girl digging her grave on the North Ridge reached Ridgewood Hollow that evening and spread through it by the following morning with the speed that only bad news travels in a small community. Harlan Beckett's judgment, and it was taken as Harlan Beckett's judgment because his word carried the weight it always carried, was delivered and accepted. The girl had lost her mind to grief. The cold would settle the matter before Christmas. There was nothing to be done for someone who refused to be helped. The last threads of communal concern snapped cleanly. Ren Voss became in the eyes of Ridgewood Hollow a ghost. And 60 feet away inside the granite heart of the North Ridge, the mountain breathed on patient and warm, paying no attention to what anyone thought. The tunnel reached 15 feet on a Wednesday. Ren knew it was Wednesday because she had been marking the days with a line scratched into the rock near the entrance, a habit her father had kept in the field because he said that a man who loses track of days loses track of himself, and a geologist who loses track of himself is useless to the mountain. She had 17 marks when the tunnel reached 15 feet, which meant she had lost 2 days somewhere in the blur of digging and sleeping and foraging and digging again, and she decided that was acceptable. Acceptable was the new standard. Not good, not comfortable, not adequate. Acceptable meant still alive, still moving, still making progress. 15 feet in the tunnel widened naturally where a seam of softer schist had eroded around a harder granite core, and Wren recognized this as the place her father's diagram had indicated. She spent 3 days working the space outward, not straight in any direction, but following the natural contours of the rock, learning what the mountain was willing to give and what it intended to keep. This was something her father had written about in the early pages of the journal, in a passage she had read so many times she could recite it from memory. The geologist's first error is to impose his design on the Earth. The Earth has its own design formed over millions of years, and it is invariably more sophisticated than anything a man can devise in an afternoon. The better approach is to ask the Earth what it has already made and then make yourself small enough to fit inside it. She made herself small. By the end of the 3rd week the chamber existed. It was not large. 10 feet across at its widest point, roughly circular, the ceiling high enough at the center for her to stand with 2 inches to spare. The walls were rough cut where she had worked them, and naturally smooth where the schist had its own surface, and in the lamplight, she had made a tallow lamp from deer fat rendered in a tin cup she'd found discarded near the creek. The walls had a quality she had not expected. They gleamed faintly. The mineral content of the rock caught the light and held it. At the far end of this chamber, where the natural fissure ran deepest, the air moved. It moved the way breathing moves, not a draft, not a current, but a steady and rhythmic exhalation that carried warmth up from somewhere far below her feet, from depths that had nothing to do with the season above. The temperature of the Earth's interior was not subject to November. It had not consulted the calendar. It simply was what it had always been, and it breathed that constancy upward through the fissure with the patience of something that measured time in geological epochs rather than winters. Wren pressed both palms flat against the chamber wall one evening and held them there. The rock was warm, not warm like a surface near a fire, warm like a living thing. A deep, resonant warmth that seemed to come from inside the stone rather than from any external source, because that was precisely what it was. The rock had been absorbing the geothermal heat for weeks, storing it in its dense mineral structure, the way a brick absorbs the afternoon sun and radiates it back through the evening. The walls were not just surrounding her, they were participating. They were part of the system. She thought of her father's note in the margin of the diagram. She isn't living in a space heated by something. She is living inside the heater itself. The She had surprised her when she first read it. She had gone back and read it 3 times, trying to decide if it was a slip of the pen, a grammatical habit, some pronoun her father used generically. Then she had turned to the inside cover of the journal where he had written her name, and she had understood that the diagram had always been for her. That the 10 years of research, the careful maps, the cross-section drawings, and the mineral notations, and the field observations, all of it had been moving in her father's quiet and methodical way toward this specific gift. He had known she would need it before she had known she would need it. She sat with that understanding for a long time alone in her warm chamber in the dark heart of the mountain, the tallow lamp casting its small circle of amber light on the gleaming walls. Outside, November was dismantling the last of the world's warmth with systematic efficiency. Inside, the mountain breathed. She opened the journal to the last pages and found the one she had been avoiding since the beginning, a page torn in half. She had noticed it the first night she read the journal by starlight, and she had told herself it was damage in old journal, years of field-use pages wore out and tore. She had almost believed this. But the tear was too clean along the top edge, and the bottom half was too completely gone, with no remnant caught in the binding. Someone had removed that page deliberately. What remained was the bottom half of what had been a longer note in her father's handwriting. The ink slightly different from the surrounding pages written later. She thought perhaps much later, perhaps after he had been to this place himself. The fragment read, "The earth does not give to those who demand. It gives only to those who," and then nothing. She had built a small clay shelf into the wall near her sleeping niche, and she kept the journal there open to that page where she could see it when she woke. Not because it comforted her, because it reminded her that her father had stood in this place or close to it and had written something he thought important enough to record, and that something had been taken from her, and she did not know yet what it was, and not knowing was a different kind of cold. By the 1st of December, she had finished the chamber. She had smoothed the floor with a flat stone, working methodically until it was level enough to sleep on without rolling. She had carved 3 niches into the softer sections of wall, one for the journal and the lamp one for her food stores, one that she shaped carefully into a sleeping alcove with a slight upward curve at the head end, the way she had seen illustrated in a picture book about ancient dwellings that her father had kept on a shelf. Near the entrance, where the natural draft from the fissure created a reliable flow of air, moving outward, she had built a small oven from creek clay packed carefully around a frame of flat stones. It had taken her 4 attempts to get the clay mixture right too dry, and it cracked in the curing too wet, and it slumped before it set. The 4th attempt held. She had cured it slowly with small fires of dry pine feeding the flame, carefully watching the clay darken and harden over 2 days. The first time she baked bread in it, the smell filled the chamber and moved out through the entrance passage and dispersed into the cold mountain air outside, and she sat on the warm stone floor and ate the imperfect, slightly dense, completely real loaf, and understood something that was difficult to articulate but felt important. She was not enduring. She was not waiting for the winter to end. She was living inside it the way her father had said, not fighting the mountain, but listening to it, and the mountain was answering. She added a line to the torn page in the journal in her own hand beneath the fragment of her father's note. "I think I know what you were going to say." She closed the journal and put it back on its shelf. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind that came down from the higher ridges carried the particular sharp scent of ice forming at altitude. The old-timers in Ridgewood Hollow, she knew this without needing to be there, would be looking at that sky and reading it the way her father read rock formations. And what they would read in it would not be comfortable. It was on a Thursday in mid-December, 11 days before the storm broke, that Harlan Beckett climbed the North Ridge alone. He told himself he was checking the upper woodlot. He had timber up there, a stand of mature oak he had been planning to harvest that fall, and had delayed on, and with the winter shaping up the way it was shaping up, it was reasonable to go assess what he had available. This was what he told himself, and it was not entirely a lie. He did own timber on the North Ridge. He did look at it briefly. But what brought him to the North Ridge on a Thursday morning, there was something that had been working in him since the day he found the Voss girl at the cliff face, something small and persistent that he had no good name for. He had constructed his verdict about her situation promptly and delivered it with the confidence that people in Ridgewood Hollow had come to expect from him, and the verdict was correct. He was certain it was correct, and yet the words she had said as he turned to leave had followed him home and sat down in the back of his mind and had not left. Everything you build is made of wood. Wood burns out. I'm building with something older than fire. He had turned the words over while he split morning kindling. He had found them waiting for him in the gray interval between sleeping and waking. He had heard in them a faint and irritating echo of something his own father had said once a long time ago, something about the first people who had come to these mountains before the log cabins and the iron stoves, before the kind of civilization you could nail together and deed to your children. His father had said those people knew things about the land that had been forgotten. He had not specified what things. Harlan was not a man who liked the feeling of an incomplete thought. He found the North Ridge as he expected it, cold bare, the granite walls gray and indifferent against the sky the color of iron. He looked at the wood lot for perhaps 10 minutes, making mental notes. Then he walked along the base of the granite face toward the place he had seen the girl. He stopped 20 feet away. The ground around the entrance was not frozen. This was the fact that made him go still in a way that had nothing to do with hunting. The surrounding earth was hard as iron, the frost thick enough to crunch under his boots. But in a rough circle of perhaps 15 feet, round the base of the cliff face, the ground was soft. Not warm to look at, it was November in the Blue Ridge, and nothing looked warm but visibly, undeniably unfrozen in a way that had no meteorological explanation. And from the opening in the rock face wider now, he noted substantially wider, with a covering of stitched deer hide hanging over it there, rose a thin column of vapor. Not smoke. Steam. The kind of vapor that rises when something warm meets something cold. He stood and looked at it for a long time. He did not approach. He was not yet ready to approach. That was the most honest accounting he could make of why he stood at 20 feet and looked rather than walked forward. He was not afraid. He was not skeptical. He was past skepticism because skepticism requires an alternative explanation, and he had none. He was simply not ready in the way a man is not ready to open a letter that he knows will change something. He turned and walked back down the ridge. He said nothing to anyone. He split his evening kindling with slightly more force than necessary. His wife Edith asked him at supper if everything was all right, and he said yes, everything was fine, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him for 31 years of marriage, which was the look of a woman who knows perfectly well that everything is not fine, but understands that some things have to travel at their own speed. He lay awake that night listening to the wind build in the pines above the cabin and thought about frozen ground and rising steam in a 15-year-old girl who had told him she was building with something older than fire. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, not with snow first, but with cold. A cold so total and so sudden that it seemed less like a change in temperature than a change in the nature of the air itself, as if the atmosphere had simply decided to become a different substance, one that conducted heat away from living things with deliberate efficiency. The creek at the bottom of the hollow froze solid in a single night, not at the edges first the way creeks normally freeze, but all at once the current stilling and hardening in a matter of hours. Wren heard it from inside her chamber, a deep resonant crack that traveled through the ground and up through the rock walls and arrived as a vibration she felt in her palms before she heard it as sound. She went to the entrance and looked out. The sky was the color of a bruise, a deep purple gray that pressed down on the ridgeline like something with weight. The air had a stillness that was not peace but anticipation. The pines along the ridge were motionless, their branches heavy with cold, and the silence was the specific silence that precedes very large events. She went back inside. She stoked her small cooking fire briefly, made a cup of pine needle tea that her father had noted in the journal as a useful source of winter vitamins, and ate the last of the smoked trout she had put up from the creek before it froze. She checked her food stores, enough dried berries and hardtack and preserved mushrooms to last 3 weeks if she was careful. She checked the tallow in her lamp. Then she sat down on her warm stone floor, opened the journal to the diagram of the earth hearth, and read her father's notes for what was probably the 20th time. She was not afraid of the storm. This surprised her because she had imagined in the weeks of digging and building that the fear would arrive with the snow and she would have to manage it. Instead, she found something that was not quite confidence, but was adjacent to it, a quietness that came from having done the work, from having listened to what her father's notes were telling her and then done the actual physical thing those notes described. The mountain had not asked her to be brave. It had asked her to be attentive. She had been attentive, and the rock around her was warm, and the fissure breezed steadily at the back of the chamber, and whatever was coming down from the high ridges would come, and she would be here when it passed. The snow began the following morning. It came in silence at first, large slow flakes that fell without wind, straight down as if the sky were simply emptying. By midday, the ground outside the entrance was covered to the depth of her boot. By evening, she could no longer see the 3 birch trees from the entrance. She hung the second deer hide over the opening and listened to the snowfall change. As the wind arrived, the whisper becoming a hiss, and the hiss becoming a roar that she felt as pressure against the rock above her rather than sound in the air around her. The mountain absorbed it. The noise that reached her inside the chamber was distant and abstract, like weather heard from inside a deep house. The walls did not tremble. The fissure continued its patient exhalation. The temperature inside did not change. She read, she slept, she ate carefully. She worked on a second pair of moccasins from the deer hide she had cured using a bone needle and sinew she had prepared from a deer's leg tendon, following a technique her father had described in an appendix note at the back of the journal under the heading, Practical Skills from the Survey Seasons. The stitching was imperfect, but the result was functional, which was the standard she had adopted for everything. On the 3rd day of the storm, she thought about Ridgewood Hollow. She thought about it the way you think about something you have moved away from, not with longing exactly, but with a particular clarity of distance. She could picture the cabin interiors, the cast iron stoves burning through their supplies of split oak, the heat rising to the rafters, while the floors stayed cold, the frost forming on the inside of log walls, where the chinking had cracked and the wind found its way in. She could picture the children huddled close to the stoves, the parents making the constant calculation of warmth against fuel, the slow anxiety of a wood pile that was going down faster than expected. She did not feel superior. She felt something closer to grief. Her father had known about this place for years. He had drawn the diagram, made the notes, mapped the location. He had tried in his quiet and indirect way to talk to people about what the mountains contained, and they had listened the way people listen to someone who speaks a language they have decided in advance is not worth learning. She had understood as a child that her father was lonely in a particular way that had nothing to do with company. He was lonely in the way of a person who has something important to say and no one to say it to. She pulled the journal from its shelf and turned to the torn page. She looked at the fragment of her father's note for a long time. The earth does not give to those who demand. It gives only to those who... She thought about the months she had just spent, the 9 days of digging before the tunnel was deep enough to sleep in, the failed clay ovens, the broken shale tools, the mornings when her hands were so damaged she could barely hold the improvised blade. The 2 days she had nearly given up, days she had not written about in the journal's margins, because she was not ready to give them permanence, days when the cold and the hunger and the loneliness had combined into a weight that made the effort feel not just difficult, but meaningless. On both of those days, she had gone to the entrance of the tunnel, sat in the warmth that moved against her face and waited. Not praying exactly, not deciding anything, just waiting. And on both days, something had shifted, not in the mountain, in her. She picked up the bone stylus she used for writing in the journal and completed the sentence in her own hand. The earth does not give to those who demand. It gives only to those who wait. She looked at it for a moment. Then she added one more line below, smaller in the margin. I found the other half of this page, Papa. It was inside me. In Ridgewood Hollow on the fifth night of the storm, Harlan Beckett stood at the window of his cabin and watched the snow move horizontally past the glass in solid curtains of white and felt a fear he had not expected. He had enough wood. He had calculated carefully 2 cords stacked in the covered shed enough for 10 days at the rate he was burning, and the storm could not last 10 days. These were the rational numbers, and Harlan was a man who trusted rational numbers. But his youngest son, Joel, had been coughing since the second day of the storm. It had started as that kind of cough children get when the cold air first comes. A dry, irritable thing, nothing alarming. By the third day, it had deepened. By the fifth day, it had become something else entirely, a wet, rattling sound that came from too far inside the boy's chest, that shook his small body with a violence disproportionate to his size that woke him in the night and left him pale and sweating and struggling for air that seemed to resist him. Edith had made every remedy she knew. Hot broth, poultices of mustard and lard applied to the chest steam from a pot of boiling water infused with pine bark. Joel bore all of it with the patient misery of a sick child, and the cough did not improve. Harlan stood at the window and watched the blizzard and listened to his son cough in the back room and felt the cold coming through the glass against his face despite the fire roaring 6 feet behind him, and understood something that his entire life's experience of building and providing had not prepared him for. He could not build his way out of this. He could not solve it with seasoned oak and a well-constructed stove. He could not nail it together or deed it to his children. The fire shouted its heat at the ceiling, and the floor stayed cold, and the walls held their frost, and his son coughed the rattling cough of a child whose lungs were losing an argument with the winter, and there was nothing in Harlan Beckett's considerable inventory of practical skills that addressed this specific problem. He thought of the vapor rising from the cliff face. He thought of the ground that would not freeze. He thought of a 15-year-old girl pressing her palms against a warm stone wall with the calm expression of someone who has already solved the problem you are only now beginning to understand you have. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he went to the hooks by the door and began putting on every layer of wool he owned. Edith came out of the back room and looked at him. She looked at the door. She looked at him again. I need to check on something, he said. He knew it was a poor excuse. She knew it too. Her eyes went to the back room where Joel coughed once and then subsided into the labored silence between coughs, and then back to Harlan, and in them was the question she had enough trust in him not to ask aloud. He buttoned his coat. I'll be back, he said, which was not an answer but was the best he could give. He opened the door and the storm came in. The cold was a physical assault, the kind that does not negotiate. It hit him across the face and drove the breath back into his chest, and in the first 10 seconds made clear that it intended to kill him if he gave it the opportunity. He put his head down and walked into it. The snow was waist-deep in the open stretches and chest-deep in the drifts. He moved along the tree line where the canopy had sheltered the ground somewhat, which was slower but survivable. The wind screamed in the pines above him with a sound that was not like anything he could name, not like an animal, not like weather, but like a sustained and fundamental wrongness in the air. It took him nearly an hour to cover ground he normally walked in 10 minutes. He thought during that hour about his son's cough. He thought about the warmth he had felt at the entrance of the rock face weeks ago when he had reached out his hand and pulled it back and told himself cave damp. He thought about the long, flat certainty of his own judgment and how it had never felt until recently like something that could be questioned. He thought about Ren Voss at 15 years old, alone on a mountain building with something older than fire. He arrived at the base of the ridge. He pushed through the last drift and reached the granite face and stopped. The snow was gone, not brushed aside, not compressed, gone. In a rough circle around the entrance, the ground was bare and soft, the frost entirely absent, as if the cliff face existed in a different season than the rest of the mountain. The snow had melted at the perimeter of whatever warmth moved through the rock, creating a clear, dark patch of earth that in the context of the surrounding white landscape looked inexplicable, impossible, like a hole cut through the winter to show what was underneath. From the entrance beneath the hanging deer, hides a slow curl of vapor rose and was immediately seized by the wind and torn to nothing. Harlan stood at the edge of the clear ground for a long moment. His beard was solid ice. His lungs burned with each breath. He had spent an hour fighting through a blizzard that wanted him dead, and he was standing in front of a crack in a rock that a 15-year-old girl had opened with a piece of broken shale, and the ground around it was warm, and he had told her it was folly. He walked forward. He reached the entrance and put out his hand and pulled aside the heavy deer hide. The warmth that came out was not a gust, not a wave. It was a continuous and unhurried presence, like stepping into a room that has been lived in and warmed for a long time by something patient and permanent. It smelled of earth and damp stone and something he could not immediately identify, and then did bread. Fresh baked bread. He bent and looked inside. The lamp threw its amber circle on walls that gleamed with mineral light. The floor was smooth and level. Niches in the walls held organized supplies and a journal and a lamp with a steady flame. At the far end of the chamber, the feature exhaled its ancient warmth into the still air. And Ren Voss sat on the floor beside her small clay oven, barefoot on the warm stone, looking up at him with her father's eyes. "I saw your tracks last time, Mr. Beckett," she said. Her voice was quiet and unhurried. "I wondered how long it would take." Harlan Beckett, who had built everything in Ridgewood Hollow worth building, who had never in 30 years of community life been at a loss for the right practical response to a situation, opened his mouth and found nothing there. He stepped inside. The warmth closed around him like a hand. He pulled off his glove and pressed his palm flat against the nearest wall. The rock was warm, not surface warm, not recently warm from deep inside, warm in the way of something that had been warm since before anyone living had been born, warm in the way of the earth itself. He stood with his hand against the wall and felt his certainty, the decades-long, load-bearing certainty that had held the structure of his judgment together, begin slowly and irrevocably to come apart. Ren stood. She crossed to the pile of furs in the sleeping alcove and brought one back and laid it across his shoulders without comment. Then she went to the small clay oven and removed a small round loaf of bread and broke it and offered him half. He took it. The bread was warm in his frozen hands. He held it and looked at this child in her simple cotton dress, standing barefoot on a warm stone floor in a warm chamber inside a mountain, while a blizzard tried to end the world outside, and he felt the full weight of what he had said to her bearing down on him from a direction he had not expected. "Your stove shouts to keep the cold out," she said quietly and without triumph. "My hearth tells a story to invite the warmth in." He looked at her. He looked at the walls, the lamp, the journal on its shelf, the evidence of weeks of solitary, methodical, precise, and patient work. He thought of Joel's cough. "My son is sick," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the cold and by something else. "He's been coughing for 5 days. The fever started last night." Ren looked at him for a moment. "Bring him here," she said. Harlan Beckett stood in the warmth of the earth hearth and felt the bread in his hand and heard those 2 words, "bring him here," and experienced something he had no ready category for. He was a man who had given instructions his entire adult life. He had told men where to cut and how deep and at what angle. He had told the hollow which trees to take and which to leave. He had told his children how to work and his neighbors how to build, and without meaning to, without malice, he had told a 15-year-old girl that what she was doing was folly and that she would die for it. He had always been the one who knew. Being told what to do in 2 quiet words by the person he had condemned was a different kind of cold entirely. He did not argue. There was nothing in him left to argue with. He looked around the chamber one more time. The warm walls, the steady lamp, the fissure breathing its ancient constancy at the far end, and then he nodded once, pulled the fur closer around his shoulders, and went back out into the storm. The return journey was worse than the approach, because now he was moving against the wind rather than with it, and because the hour he had spent inside the earth hearth had begun to unknot the cold from his muscles, making the return to the blizzard feel more violent by contrast. He moved with his head down and his thoughts on Joel, on the rattling cough, on the particular gray color the boy's face had taken on since the fever arrived. Lung fever. He had seen it before. He had seen it take children who were cared for in warm cabins by experienced mothers with good food and every remedy the hollow knew. The knowledge of what it could do moved in him like something with weight. He reached the cabin and pushed through the door, and the storm came in with him before he could get it closed, driving a scattering of snow across the plank floor. Edith was in the back room. He could hear her voice low and steady, the voice she used when she was keeping fear out of her words for the benefit of the person she was speaking to. He shook the snow from his coat and went to the doorway. Joel was awake, propped on pillows, his face the wrong color. Not the red of a healthy child's cold weather flush, but the chalky interior pallor of fever, as if the illness were slowly replacing him from the inside. His eyes, when they found his father's, had the particular expression of sick children everywhere. Not fear exactly, but a searching, a question the child cannot articulate, but the parent always understands. Will you fix this? Edith looked up at Harlan. She had been a strong woman her entire life, strong in the specific way of women who have had to be, and she had not let herself show what she was feeling since the cough deepened. But her eyes, now meeting his across their son's sickbed, were asking the same question Joel's were. Harlan said, "Get him dressed. Everything warm we have." Edith stared at him. Harlan, "I know where to take him," he said. "Where it's warm, more warm than this house. I know it sounds," he stopped. He had been about to say, "I know it sounds unlikely," which was so profound an understatement that it almost broke something in him. He said instead, "Trust me." Edith had trusted him for 31 years. She had trusted him with her life and her children's lives in the shape of everything she had built. She looked at him now, and whatever she saw in his face, not certainty, which was what she usually saw there, but something rawer, something cracked open and honest, made her stand up without another word and begin layering wool onto their sick boy. The three of them moved through the blizzard in a formation that Harlan would remember for the rest of his life. He went first, breaking the trail, his broad body deflecting the worst of the wind. Edith followed close behind him, carrying Joel against her chest inside her coat, the boy's legs wrapped around her and his head tucked beneath her chin. They did not speak. The storm made speech impossible, and there was nothing to say that was more important than moving. Joel coughed twice during the journey, each time a sound that cut through the wind and landed in Harlan's chest like something physical. He moved faster. When they reached the North Ridge and Harlan pushed through the last drift and the ground beneath them changed, softened, lost its frost, became the impossible bare earth of the warm circle. Edith made a sound he had never heard from her before. Not a word, a sound, the sound of a person encountering something that does not fit inside any framework they have ever constructed for the world. He pulled the deer hide aside. The warmth came out. Edith stepped through the entrance with Joel and stopped. She stood in the amber light of the tallow lamp and looked at the warm walls and the smooth floor and the steady flame and the fissure breathing at the far end. And then she looked at Ren Voss standing quietly to one side, 15 years old in a cotton dress with bare feet on warm stone, and Edith's face did something complicated and private that Harlan looked away from because it was not meant for him to see. She carried Joel to the sleeping alcove at the rear of the chamber, near the fissure where the air was warmest. She laid him down on the soft deer hides and unwrapped his outer layers and put her hand on his forehead. The fever was still there, a dry, insistent heat that had nothing to do with the warmth around him. But she could feel already the difference in the air he was breathing. It was not the brittle, dusty cold of the cabin. It was warm and moist, carrying the mineral cleanness of deep earth. And when Joel breathed it in, he did not cough. He breathed again. He did not cough. Edith sat beside him and held his hand and did not look at anyone. Wren brought a cup of hot pine needle tea. She had a small pot warming on a flat stone near the cooking oven and set it beside Edith without speaking. Then she went back to what she had been doing before they arrived, which was working on a length of sinew cord with the methodical focus of someone for whom the activity is a form of courtesy, a way of giving the newcomers the privacy of being unobserved. Harlan settled onto the floor near the entrance, his back against the warm wall, and felt the heat of the earth begin to work on him from all directions simultaneously, from below, through the stone floor, from behind, through the rock wall, from the air itself, which carried warmth evenly throughout the chamber without the violent directional heat of an open fire. His boots, which had been iron cold since he stepped outside, began to feel like boots again rather than encasements. He watched his son breathe in the warm air and not cough. He sat with that for a long time. They stayed 3 days. The storm did not relent on the first day or the second. On the morning of the third day, a change came into the air, a slight softening, a diminishment of the wind's conviction. And Harlan, who had spent a lifetime reading the weather of these mountains, recognized it as the storm beginning to exhaust itself. He said nothing about it. 3 days in the earth hearth, and none of them were ready to leave. Joel's fever broke on the second night. Harlan was awake when it happened. He had been sleeping in the fitful way of parents who cannot fully rest while their child is sick, half present in some vigilant middle state. And he heard the change in his son's breathing. Lighter, easier. The wet rattle that had been there for 6 days was not gone, but it had moved, become less structural, less fundamental. He sat up and looked at Joel in the lamplight and saw that the boy's face had lost the chalky interior pallor and was simply sleeping the ordinary sleep of a child rather than the heavy, effortful unconsciousness of fever. Edith was awake too. They looked at each other across their sleeping son and did not speak because what was happening was too large for the words either of them had available. In the mornings, Wren cooked at the small clay oven. She made hardtack from her flour stores, coarse and simple, but warm, and shared it without ceremony the way you share food with people who are in your home. Edith, on the second morning, woke early and began helping without being asked, patching a section of the clay oven's rim that had cracked slightly from repeated use working the clay with quick, competent hands. She had her own domestic skills, her own knowledge of making things hold together, and she applied them to the earth hearth, the way you apply yourself to the work of a place you have decided to respect. Nobody talked about what had happened, not directly. The Becketts were not a family given to direct conversation about large things. That was a kind of intimacy they kept private. But on the afternoon of the second day, while Edith sat with Joel and Wren worked on her sinew cord, Harlan asked her a question. "Your father," he said, "he drew all this, the plans." "Yes," Wren said. "He had been here, to this place." "I think so. Yes." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know," he said and stopped. He started again. "I said things about your father that I would not say now." Wren looked up from her work. Her expression was not forgiving. Exactly, forgiveness implies that a wrong has been held, and she did not appear to be holding it. It was more neutral than that and more final. The expression of someone who has moved past the point where the wrong matters to them, not because it was small, because she has found something larger to attend to. "He knew you wouldn't understand," she said. "He wrote about that in the journal. He wasn't angry about it. He said most people can only know what they can touch." "He was right about that," Harlan said. "He was right about a lot of things," Wren said and went back to her work. On the morning of the third day, the storm was over. It did not end dramatically. The wind simply stopped as if a door had been closed somewhere in the upper atmosphere, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and sudden that it woke all four of them at once. Harlan went to the entrance and pulled the deer hide aside and looked out at a world so entirely transformed that it took his eyes a moment to trust what they were seeing. The Blue Ridge Mountains had become a different place. Every surface was white and still and exact. The snow compressed and settled into sharp angles by the wind. The trees waited and bent into new shapes. The sky above was a cold, brilliant, cloudless blue of the kind that only arrives after great violence. And the light that came off the snow was so intense it was almost painful after 3 days of lamplight. He stood in the entrance of the earth hearth in the warmth that moved past him and out into the cold morning and looked at the world the storm had made. Behind him, Joel was awake and asking for food. The walk back to Ridgewood Hollow took most of the morning. The drifts had settled into a hard crust in the night cold, and Harlan broke trail while Edith and Joel followed in the channel he made. The boy walked under his own power, which alone was enough to make the effort feel like something other than hardship. They arrived in the hollow to find the community intact but shaken. The storm had taken a toll: three families with collapsed outbuildings, two with exhausted woodpiles, one elderly man who had not been found until the morning after the storm broke, frozen in his chair by a fire that had gone out in the night. The hollow had the particular subdued quality of a place that has survived something and is not yet sure what it cost. Harlan spent the first day helping dig out the worst affected families, assessing damage, organizing the distribution of wood from the community stack. This was what he did and who he was, and he did it without needing to think about it. But while he worked, he was also thinking about something else. On the second day after the storm, he called a gathering at the mill. The men of Ridgewood Hollow came in their heavy coats, stamping snow from their boots, expecting the kind of practical post-storm accounting that Harlan usually called these gatherings for. They were surprised, therefore, when he stood in front of them and did not immediately begin talking about timber assessments or road clearing or the spring supply order. He stood quietly for a moment in the way of a man choosing words carefully because the wrong ones will not carry the weight he needs them to carry. Then he told them everything. He told it plainly, without the kind of rhetorical construction he sometimes used at these gatherings when he wanted to move the community toward a decision. He told it as testimony, the way a man describes what he has seen with his own eyes, when what he has seen obliges him to accuracy above all else. He described the pile of excavated earth on the north ridge. He described the warm ground and the rising vapor. He described the chamber, the smooth floor, the warm walls, the steady lamp, the fissure breathing at the far end. He described his son's cough and his son's fever and his son's recovery in the warmth of the earth. He told them what he had said to the Voss girl on the ridge 3 weeks before the storm. He said it exactly as he had said it. He did not soften it. There was silence in the mill. Then one of the men, a farmer named Caswell, who owned the largest property in the hollow and whose opinion carried the weight of land, said what Harlan had expected someone to say. "You're telling us a 15-year-old girl dug a warm room in a mountain and your boy got better sleeping in it," Caswell said. His voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a man applying the same reasonable skepticism to new information that he would apply to any claim that contradicted everything he had previously understood. "Yes," Harlan said. "And you think we should what exactly?" "I think you should come and see for yourselves," Harlan said. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm telling you what I saw and what happened to my son. Come and see." Another silence. Old Aldred Marsh, who was 73 and had been in the Blue Ridge longer than anyone else in the room and who had said almost nothing at community gatherings for the past decade, spoke from the back of the group. His voice was dry and deliberate, the voice of a man who saves his words and therefore spends them carefully. "My grandfather talked about warm places in the rock," Aldred said. "The old people knew about them, called them breathing spots. Said the first settlers used to shelter near them before they had the tools to build proper." He paused. "I always thought it was a story." The room was quiet in a different way now. Harlan looked at the faces around him. He saw skepticism that was expected and fair. He also saw something else, something he recognized from his own experience 3 days ago in the storm, which was the particular attentiveness of men who have recently been reminded that the winter is larger than they are and who are therefore more willing than usual to hear something new. "Come and see," he said again. They came on the 4th day after the storm, when the paths were packed enough to walk without exhausting themselves. 9 men moving up the north ridge in a line, their breath clouding in the sharp cold. Harlan led them. He did not look back to check whether they were following. Either they would see what he had seen or they wouldn't, and no amount of looking back at them would change that. He heard them go quiet when the ground changed. He heard Caswell say something low that he couldn't make out, and Aldred Marsh say nothing, which from Aldred meant more than words. He pushed the deer hide aside and let the warmth out, and then he stood back. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They went in 1 or 2 at a time, the way men enter a space they are uncertain about. sideways with their weight on their back foot, already constructing reasons for what they were seeing. They came out changed the way Harlan had come out changed, though each man wore it differently. Caswell stood outside afterward with his bare hand pressed against the rock face near the entrance, for a long time his face doing the private arithmetic of a man revising a large calculation. Old Aldred Marsh sat down on a stone when he came out and looked at the mountains around him with an expression that was not surprise but recognition, as if the world had just confirmed something he had half believed for 70 years. Wren did not perform for them. She did not explain or demonstrate or advocate. She was in the chamber when they entered, continuing the work of living there, and she answered their questions directly and briefly and referred them more than once to the journal. My father wrote about the thermal mass. Here you can read it yourself with a consistency that made clear she considered the journal the authority, not herself. One man asked her how long she had been living there alone. Since the end of October, she said. The man looked at her, at the warm chamber, the organized stores, the clay oven, the smooth floor, and was quiet for a moment. How old are you? He said, though he knew. 15, Wren said. He went back outside and did not say anything else for a long time. The changes came slowly because things that last come slowly. Harlan drove them, but carefully, not with the certainty he had carried before, which had always had a slight edge of impatience in it, but with the more deliberate force of a man who has been wrong about something important and is determined not to be wrong in the same way again. He studied the journal. He asked Wren questions and listened to the answers without filtering them through what he already believed. He was a builder. He had materials and tools and labor. What he lacked was the knowledge he had, and he acquired it the way a man acquires a skill late in life, without elegance but with commitment. The first hollow hearth was built into the hillside behind the Beckett cabin before the end of January. It was not as deep as Wren's chamber, and it did not have a geothermal vent. That was a specific geological feature of the North Ridge that could not be replicated everywhere. But it was dug into the hillside to below the frost line, lined with flat stones that Harlan's men shaped and fitted with the same skill they brought to mill construction, and insulated above by 3 feet of packed earth. The result was not the profound warmth of Wren's earth hearth. It was something more modest, a room that maintained a temperature 15 degrees warmer than the cabin during the worst cold, that breathed steadily because the earth around it breathed, that did not require a fire to stay livable. It was enough. Edith moved the children's sleeping area into it first. Joel slept there every night for the rest of that winter and did not cough again. By spring, there were hollow hearths behind 4 cabins in Ridgewood Hollow. By the following fall, 6 more were under construction. Harlan went from property to property with Wren's diagram. She had allowed him to copy it into his own working notebook, annotated with her corrections in the margins, and assessed each hillside for viability, adapting the design to what each property offered. The cast iron stoves remained. They were used for cooking, which they were excellent at, and for the early evening warmth that people wanted after a day of cold work. But the desperate all-night burning that had consumed cord after cord of split oak every winter, that was gone. The wood piles got smaller. The anxiety that had surrounded them, the constant calculation of whether you had enough and whether you would make it to spring, diminished. The children stopped dying of lung fever. This was not a small thing. In a community the size of Ridgewood Hollow, 1 or 2 children died of respiratory illness most winters, and every family had lost someone to it, and they had absorbed these losses the way people absorb losses that seem inevitable with grief, and then with the particular hardening of people who expect to grieve again. When the winters changed and the losses stopped, it took several years before anyone believed it was permanent. The absence of something terrible is hard to trust. But the winters changed. The community voted to name the Ridge Path after Wren in the spring of her 2nd year there. The proposal came from Caswell, which surprised people given his initial skepticism. He stood up at the gathering and said with the directness of a man who has recalculated something and accepted the result that the path up to the North Ridge ought to carry the name of the person who had made it worth walking. Wren heard about the proposal secondhand from Edith, who climbed the ridge to tell her about it with the slightly suppressed expression of a woman who is looking forward to a reaction. Wren was quiet for a moment. "Tell them I'm grateful," she said, "but the name should be Voss Ridge." Edith looked at her. "It was my father's work," Wren said. "His maps, his research, his diagram." She paused. "He spent 10 years on these mountains trying to tell people something that mattered. The least they can do is say his name when they walk up here." Edith said nothing for a moment. She looked around the chamber at the warm walls, the ordered niches, the small clay oven, the journal on its shelf. She had been in this room enough times now to see it clearly, to understand the full scale of what had been done here by a 15-year-old girl with a piece of broken shale and a dead man's notebook. "He'd be proud of you," Edith said. Wren looked at the journal on its shelf. "I hope so," she said. "I was never sure at the beginning if I was doing it for him or because of him." She was quiet for a moment. "I think now it was both." The path was named Voss Ridge on the small carved wooden sign that Harlan made and set at the base of the path. He added a line beneath the name in his careful millworker's lettering. He did not ask anyone's permission. He simply added it. "Map by Dr. Callum Voss. Made useful by his daughter." Wren saw it the first time she came down the ridge after it was placed and stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything, and then walked back up without saying anything. And nobody who saw her face during those moments mentioned it to anyone else, because some things are private in a way that a community instinctively knows to protect. Years later, many years enough for the hollow hearths to become simply how things were done. Unremarkably as foundations, someone found the journal. It had been kept in Wren's chamber for years, returned to its shelf each time she lent it, and each time it came back with more careful handling than it had left, as if it were accumulating reverence through use. When Ridgewood Hollow finally built a proper town hall, a small, solid building that Harlan designed, and the community built together set into the hillside in the way Wren had suggested, with a hollow hearth in its foundation, the journal was placed there. Not in a glass case, not preserved from being touched, but on a reading stand where anyone who came in could open it and read Dr. Callum Voss's careful notes on the formations of the Blue Ridge Mountains and what the earth kept inside them. Children came in on winter days and read it. Farmers came in with questions about their own hillsides and used the diagrams to plan their own modifications. Old Aldred Marsh came in and sat with it, sometimes turning pages without appearing to read, which Wren understood as his way of sitting with the confirmation of something he had carried for 70 years. The last page of the journal was blank when Callum Voss had kept it. Wren had added to it over time in the margins and in the spaces between diagrams until the pages were full of her additions. Observations, corrections, extensions of her father's theories, based on what she had learned from living inside them. And on the final page, in the steady hand of a young woman who had learned to write in firelight and lamplight, in the clear light of Blue Ridge mornings, she had added a closing entry. It was short. Mr. Beckett used to say that a stove shouts its heat for an hour and then goes quiet and you have to feed it again. Father taught me something different. The mountain tells a story of warmth that lasts forever. It has been telling it since before anyone was here to listen. All you have to do is be quiet enough to hear it. They named the ridge after him. He would have said that was unnecessary. He would have said the mountain already knew his name. He would have been right. Father, they listened. On the last morning of that first terrible winter, Harlan Beckett climbed Voss Ridge alone. He was a 58-year-old man who had spent his life building things from wood, and he walked the path with the particular care of someone who has recently revised his understanding of what is solid and what is not. The snow was still deep on either side of the packed trail, and the sky above the ridge was the pale washed blue of a winter finally releasing its grip, and the air carried the first faint suggestion of something that was not quite thaw, but was the beginning of the possibility of thaw. He found Wren at the entrance to her chamber, sitting on a flat stone in the morning sun reading the journal. She looked up when she heard him on the path and closed the book. He sat down on a stone a few feet away. They did not talk for a while. Below them in the fold of the ridge, Ridgewood Hollow was visible, the smoke from morning fires thin and domestic rather than desperate. The paths between cabins cleared and used the ordinary industry of a community that had survived. From the back of several cabins, the faint warmth haze of hollow hearths at work barely visible in the morning air. Joel's asking when he can come up and see the fissure, Harlan said. He can come any time, Wren said. Harlan nodded. He looked out over the hollow for a while. I've been thinking about the other ridges, he said, east and south, whether the same formations might be present, whether it's worth surveying. Wren looked at him. I thought I might use the journal as a starting point, he said. Your father's survey notes cover the North Ridge in detail, but the methodology applies generally. If someone who knew what to look for spent a season on the East Ridge, I can teach you what to look for, Wren said. He looked at her. I'd be grateful, he said. It was a sentence that cost him something, and she heard the cost in it, and she did not minimize it or dismiss it. She simply nodded. They sat in the morning light above the hollow for a while longer, the mountain breathing steadily beneath them, the earth remembering what it had always known. Below, the smoke rose thin and easy from the hollow hearths, and the children of Ridgewood Hollow played in the snow without anyone worrying about the wood running out, and the winter, still deep, still cold, still capable of its particular hard beauty, had lost the quality it once had of being an enemy. It was simply the season. And the earth, as it always had, was warmer than the season. You only had to be quiet enough to know it.